Welcome everyone to the December edition, a special edition of the Cause Journal of Statistics and Data Science Education webinar, looking at a special issue that came out in November. So the growing importance of reproducibility and responsible workflow in the data science and statistics curriculum. And with us today, we have Nick Horton, our editor, Aneta Piekut, from University of Sheffield, Colin Rundle from Duke University, Michaela Parker from ADSA, and Rohan Alexander from the University of Toronto, all who have articles within the special issue. Go ahead and move the slide, Nick. If you don't know me, I am the host and moderator of this series. I'm Lee Johnson from Capital University in Columbus, Ohio. So what's going on these days in the journal besides the special issue that came out in November? We've got a lot of other really interesting articles. One that I was looking at earlier, inclusive and engaging data science through music. There's some great ideas in there, including an R-Shiny app that has some k-means clustering on it and using Spotify music. So I think that's a really interesting read. It was just published at the end of November. The links that you see, obviously you can't click on them in the webinar format, but when the slides get posted, you'll be able to click on those. And one of the things that Nick has been organizing on the Scholar One, the journal website, is putting collections together of articles that cover a certain topic. And so there's a link there. One of the collections that's up right now is on teaching Simpson's paradox, confounding and causal inference. So there's a new tab there that you can look at. That's really helpful if you're looking for a particular topic. So just thought I'd point that out while we're looking at journal stuff. Next month in January, we have the rescheduled webinar from earlier this year, Scratch to R toward an inclusive pedagogy in teaching coding, with Xiumin Lao from Amherst College. So just save the date on that. I'm sure we'll get an announcement out here very soon. And we'll welcome in the new year with some R. Couple of reminders about what's coming up. USCOTS 2023 is in person, yay! The deadline for breakout sessions has passed, but if you're thinking about doing a posters and beyond, there's a couple deadlines coming up in early 2023. Also, if you're thinking maybe a birds of a feather discussion, those proposals aren't due till May. And just to save the date, registration doesn't appear to be open yet, but the conference runs June 1st through the 3rd at Penn State. And so there's the link there. And the theme is communicating with, about data, with and or about data. Just a couple other things that are going on with Cause. I saw the little celebration thing go by. I know all of us are very excited to get back together. USPROC, the undergraduate statistics project competition, which has several different categories, is always ongoing. The deadline for that is June 23rd. So as you're planning ahead for your spring courses, just something to keep in mind. And then coming up literally tomorrow, the Cause reading group is still meeting. I put the links again. Once the slides are posted, you can get those. Those slides should be up, I think, today. There's the article link. There's the registration link that's happening tomorrow from noon to 1. And you can always talk to Megan or email Megan Motko, and I'm sure you can get on the mailing list for that if you are interested in being part of that reading group and getting those emails regularly. And so we finally get to our webinar today. So Aneta Piekut is one of our presenters. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield. She's also an associate editor of the journal. Next, sort of briefly go through our speakers and then we'll get to it. Colin Rundle is an associate professor at Duke University. He was actually a guest editor on this particular issue. Michaela Parker is the founder and executive director of the Academic Data Science Alliance, and she was also a guest editor on this particular issue. Nick Horton is, of course, the editor of the Journal of Statistics and Data Science Education. He's at Amherst. And Rohan Alexander is at the University of Toronto, and he is also an associate editor of the journal. And that is where I will let Nick kind of take over and organize this and run the show.
Well, Lee, thank you very much, as always, for your help. I'm very excited today to be able to have a chance to talk with the guest editors about this special issue. I've listed, it's going to be posted promptly. There's other listings as well. I've just put the link on this to the website. But there are 11 papers in an editorial in the special issue, and I've listed them here. We'll have a chance to talk about some of them, but I would encourage people to look through these as you think about aspects of reproducibility and responsible workflow. I'm really excited by the papers that all came together. We've structured this to kind of have it be a discussion briefly with a couple of questions. I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name to get us started with this. So what insights have you gained from this paper? Can we start with Aneta?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. So just to mention a couple of things to sort of initiate discussion. I myself teach students of a second year undergraduate course how to replicate a scientific paper, which is a really difficult task. But I think reading many of these papers, we can see that embedding reproducible research and reproducible workflow is not really something that has to be complex and so difficult and hard. There are many smaller things, including like asking students to create transparent documentation, to read and review README file, to work collaboratively on a piece of a code. And many are like smaller things that students can do. So it doesn't have to be really hard and difficult task to embed reproducible research in your teaching practice. This is the first thing. And the second one, which was visible in some of the papers, but I think especially in the paper by Sanchez, Reyes, and McTavish, that it sort of also helps us to rethink our research practice, because quite often we're just maybe publishing. We pay a lot of attention to making our own research outputs open access to the data code, but then maybe they are not really very well described. The language is a little bit too difficult for some audiences. So it helps us to sort of take a step back and improve, and think about what, in terms of accessibility, what makes this materials really open. Yeah, so that's a couple of points from me.
That's great. Colin, what insights have you gained?
I think the most valuable thing for me with this was just this idea that Aneta sort of mentioned, like taking a step back. Like we all have our own ideas about reproducibility and replicability, and it's a big, complicated topic. And I think we tend to like get focused in on one thing that solves our particular problems or that particular problem at that particular day. So my context is I teach a lot of classes around statistical computing, and so there's a lot of focus on the technical tools, and often you can sort of lose the forest for the trees of like, let's fiddle with Git to ad infinitum because there's some valuable thing because it's technical. But there's so much more to it, and it's like taking a step back and thinking about what is the bigger picture, what do we actually care about doing here, what are we working towards? And so I think both just that perspective, but also on a greater scale of not just looking at it in statistical computing or statistics more broadly as science as a larger edifice. I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, that we all want to be better scientists and better members of that community, and that part of this is doing that. And so thinking about how we integrate what we're doing into that, and that's about our own practice, and it's about what we teach our students to do and that kind of thing. So I think there's a really nice survey across here that gives you a much wider perspective of this kind of thing, that gets us out of the ruts that we tend to fall into with our own practice.
Great. I think about the parable of the elephant and different kind of parts and pieces that we sometimes too narrowly focus on. And I certainly also appreciated that kind of broader vision where we're thinking very holistically. Micaela, what insights have you gained?
Yeah, it's actually funny. We're sort of following one into another, because riffing off what he just riffed off Aneta, and I can riff off of him now, because I also felt that as a whole, these papers are also excellent reminders that learning and doing data science are more than just the statistics and the computational workflows that we're all used to. There are human and societal elements that come into play, ethics, the communication, so the challenges around team writing, and then team and project elements like project management, and then of course the reproducibility that was mentioned that really is necessary both for collaboration and the trustworthiness of the results of a data project. And so I think in totality, these are great examples of kind of what's necessary for critical and robust data science. And I'll just mention briefly that I was involved in the, again, for context setting, the data science ethos paper that describes a project that we're working on right now, developing an online interactive tool for students and data science practitioners to be able to do more responsible data science. So it kind of takes the data lifecycle, the research lifecycle framework that we're all very familiar with, and integrates ethical and societal concepts at each stage in that lifecycle, the conceptual lenses of power and positionality, narratives, and socio-technical systems. And so I think as a result, we hope we've developed a model for doing data science research that's more true to life and supports the development of hopefully responsible data scientists. And I think the other papers in this volume kind of also contribute to that ecosystem.
Yeah, and I've really appreciated that aspect of the kind of the broader questions. When we came up with the title of responsible workflow and started to kind of really be taking much more seriously some of those broader aspects of data ethics and data ethos, I think it's opened my eyes to a lot of things that I thought were more mechanical. It's really good to kind of see them pulled together in that way and highlighted. Rohan, last but not least, but that's okay. You get to go first on the second question.
Oh, I didn't know that. So thank you very much for having me on the panel. I have my children in the background, so if they're screaming, it's definitely just them. And you know, but from the papers, I really liked this issue, and thanks very much to Nick for involving me in it. And there was two main takeaways. The first one was this reframing of reproducibility from something that we ought to aim for because that's what credible science requires, and we're trying to do credible science, towards a framing where, well, we're actually doing it to make our own lives easier. And we saw that with sort of like Osblom and Timber's paper, where they talk about how they encourage guided stories from the trenches and letting the students fail in a controlled way. And so I thought that this reframing came across in a few of the papers, but especially that one. And another aspect, as somebody who teaches a lot of undergraduates, is just how much we can accomplish with the undergraduates. So for instance, we see this with Lars Vilhuber and co-authors paper. And basically what they do is they have trained this cohort of undergraduates at Cornell to go through and actually reproduce papers from top economics journals. And this is actually as part of the acceptance of these papers. And I was just shocked at what they were able to accomplish with sufficiently motivated and trained undergraduates. And so I found that really inspiring and something I took away from these papers as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Rohan. And again, I have found that enormously exciting to kind of think about as an editor, where we do, prelude to what I'll talk about in a little bit, starting to think about how to make that true for this journal as well. And I think that model, which has been done thousands of papers now through the American Economic Research Association, is a really good one. I'm going to turn things now back to Rohan, and while he prepares for some next steps that he's planning to take, I wanted to encourage the audience, if you have questions for us, we've structured this webinar so that there's time for audience Q&A. We would love to hear what your reflections, your ideas, your thoughts. But first, Rohan and company, what next steps are you planning to take?
So just immediately, I've tried to integrate undergraduate training into my own grant writing. In Canada, we have a very high focus on HQQC, highly qualified personnel, and this is typically graduate students. And so at a personal level, I've tried to integrate undergraduates into that. But on a more meta level, being interested in sort of reproducibility, I think can feel very isolating. And I actually got a pushback from my own department when I asked for contributions to this issue. And so it was just really wonderful to see how the broader statistics and data science education community reacted to these. And I think I'm looking forward to trying to be a little bit more active myself in these areas in terms of reproducibility and integrating into teaching going forward. So those are the two aspects.
That's great. Micaela, what next steps are you planning to take?
Yeah, I again sort of riffing off what Rohan said. I think that this volume demonstrates that there are lots of creative ways of teaching reproducible and responsible data science. So I think for me, with my position, I don't teach, I convene a community. We run a lot of events. And so part of our job is creating awareness around important topics. And so for me, I'm going to lean into that pretty heavily. This journal and this webinar are great ways to kind of highlight all of these really creative approaches, but I think we could lean into that even more. For example, I've been giving a ton of talks on that ethos tool. I am right now in a hotel room in Chicago because I'm attending the American Geophysical Union fall meeting where I talked about the ethos tool. And I just want to do a very brief anecdote around this awareness because so for example, I am on a steering committee for ethics in AI and machine learning for AGU. There's the reason I'm here. We convened a town hall around some of the initial results. And one of the audience members came up to the microphone and said, and kind of challenged us to say, well, why are these ethics guidelines any different for AI than just science? Aren't we just talking about science ethics? And I think that kind of highlights the fact that there's an awareness issue. We all kind of need to keep hammering home that data science or AI are different because of their scale, because of the potential for impact. My colleague and steering committee member at Penn State, Guido Cervone, was the one who pointed out that it's the scale and ease of use of AI tools right now that runs the risk of much greater impact than we've ever seen before. It reminds me of the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility. And so I add to this that on top of that, data science is super interdisciplinary, more than any other field we've seen before. So I kind of argue that we're in a time in history where science is no longer, the isolated scientist behind the computer or the lab bench, but that teamwork and collaboration with community members, stakeholders, it's not just beneficial to our science, it's essential to our science. And so the papers in this volume are presenting tools to achieve that productive collaboration that leads to trustworthiness of our results. And so for me, it's about shouting out that there are these really elegant solutions to some of the challenges of teaching reproducibility or team collaboration and writing up reports that I think we could all kind of help elevate in the chatter in the universe.
Great, Micaela, again, I think those ideas are just so relevant. And as you talk about things happening at the AGU with kind of broader kind of scientific questions, these data ethics, chat GPT, all over the place, it really is a both exciting and terrifying time at the same time. And we need to make sure that those decisions are being made well. What I've really appreciated from working with all of you is how different the environments you inhabit and live in. You are engaged in all kinds of different separately complementary areas. Micaela, your work with the Academic Data Science Alliance is, I think, helping to build a community in ways and to kind of tie together from the doctoral programs to kind of K12 coming up through community colleges and four-year colleges. And I think those perspectives have helped make this an even better issue. To turn things to Colin now, Colin, what are you thinking about next steps?
So again, the ordering's worked out really well for me. So I think what Micaela was saying is actually one of the areas that I feel like sort of the most direct implication from, and I think the paper did a really good job of contextualizing it around reproducibility, which is a really nice way to bring it into what I'm doing. But this need for like ethics within data science, machine learning, and all these kinds of areas is really foundational. It's something I think I'm doing not as good a job as I could. And it's something we bring up sort of incidentally along the way, but I think it needs to be a lot more foundational. And some of this work gives a nice framework for doing that in a more sort of rigorous and involved way, which I really appreciate. And it's a lot to think about and a lot to do, but I think there's really valuable kinds of things there that will help push it forward. I think the rest is also, again, just giving me more sort of incentive to structure this as I tend to treat reproducibility in my courses as a eat your vegetables kind of thing. Do as we say without giving them the full context as to why this is so important, other than sort of an introductory lecture at the beginning of, trust me, at some point you'll need this and it'll be really important. But I think connecting it to the larger edifice of what we're doing, what they're going to be when they graduate, and then also showing how it ties in not to just what we're doing now, but to what they may do in their careers, because we have students who are going on to all sorts of different areas, and it's, if they think it's only applicable in this one small area, I don't think I've done my job very well. So I think this gives a lot more ability to give more context, and I greatly appreciate that.
Colin, I would say amen to that in terms of this. I think we've made a big transition. It used to be a lot of these things were just kind of like you learn them on the streets, or that's what you would kind of get in your first couple of years in the workforce, or, you know, but it would really be kind of side issues that were not felt to be important. And now I think we're at a point where we kind of have some of these parts and pieces, but having the framework and the foundation that's there as part of broader science education, statistics and data science education, I think is really valuable. Aneta, last but not least.
Yeah, so for me, it's been a journey like for a few years, like starting in 2020 when I was a fellow for Project here. And you remember we organized this seminar during the first months of the pandemic, a symposium which was happening every Friday around teaching reproducible research. And I think some of this, a couple of papers probably are now in the special issue, but from this time I think once you start thinking about this, you can't stop thinking about how to improve your teaching. So I think one of the papers, which was summarizing a different event, they was talking about that this is a part of the lifelong learning for us, you know, as this is a very dynamic field changing, and as you were saying, the foundation are still being created. We're thinking more about ethics. We all the time have to now improve our teaching. So in this sort of a hunger, we're organizing another event, but this time in the UK, in Sheffield, in person. And this is also because while this is becoming a little bit more a norm to think about reproducible research in more science discipline, psychology, data science, statistics, economics, as a social sciences, I feel like this is a bit less developed in some social sciences disciplines when we teach quantitative methods. So I would like to invite everybody, but also invite different scholars from trying to reach academics from arts and humanities, social science, and other disciplines to talk together. I will copy them in the chat. There is a call for papers for a symposium happening in June. And this is a part of the 3-day event we'll be talking about. It's called Teaching Reproducible Research and Open Science. So it's about undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. So we've been really discussing a lot about our research, and now this special issue, but also this event will will reflect about how we can teach it, how we can improve our practice, and what different disciplines, like in here we'll have people from very different countries, disciplines, that are different experiences, what we can learn from each other. Yeah, so I welcome, and I think that we have like a large group of participants today, so it's great for me that I can advertise it here. I'm also on Twitter and Mastodon Social Sciences, so interesting, it's been more popular on Mastodon, and it's been reposted quite a lot of times on Mastodon, not so much on Twitter yet.
Great. Well, Aneta, I want to personally thank you and the Project Here folks for getting us to where we are here today. I had the opportunity to be one of the speakers in your slow food kind of symposium, which I thought was remarkable as a way to kind of allow us to kind of work through some of these things with the, I believe, 10 speakers you had over that 10-week, 12-week event. And that was really what led to kind of thinking about this special issue, because there were so many concrete ideas and different perspectives and approaches there. And then Rohan, soon afterwards, your Toronto reproducibility workshop came across my my door. I believe Micaela Rundel was one of the speakers in that, and alerted me to it, and I was able to drop in and hear about some of the great things that are happening in Toronto, Canada, and elsewhere. And so again, thanks for that. I think the next steps for me, using my moderator position, are to kind of try to build that Vilhuber-like thing with my students here at Amherst College, to start to work with the data and code that authors for the Open Access Journal of Statistics and Data Science Education bring together. And so that's kind of my next step. We've got some questions here, and I'm going to start with the first question that's curious about the panelists' thoughts on integrating this sort of content to graduate education, both for statistics and data science graduate students, students in other areas of science who have different needs, but some overlaps with a huge heterogeneity in their background. And I know we have expertise from the graduate level in terms of kind of the social sciences and statistics, but I wonder if there's someone who might want to hop in there on that first question.
I can speak to it a little bit. So my teaching, I do teaching at both the undergraduate and graduate level. So a lot of the stuff I teach is for our first year MS students in a Master's of Statistical Science. It's a 2-year program. And so I think for that, it works really well. We get very heterogeneous students, some who've worked professionally as data scientists, others who are coming in from disciplines. So like a student who was a chemical engineer and decided to change their career path. So there's lots of variety there in terms of background, and that's both quantitative and technical and across the board. I think this stuff is foundational for them, and that's why I put it in the classes and basically make them do it and engage with it. And it's one of those things that we can very clearly see the downstream effects of it, because it just becomes that much easier that it becomes the native workflow for their other courses. And other faculty in our department believe more or less in some of these things, or will adopt some of the tools or not other the tools. But generally, it's one of these kind of things, the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. And so they don't have a better way of working, and they will pick it up because they can hopefully see the utility of it. We definitely see that. We do less of a good job with our PhD students. I think we still suffer a little bit from this attitude of, well, it's important, but you'll pick it up along the way. Learn it on the streets, as Nick said. And I think we can do better than that. It needs to be more than like a 1-day boot camp or a workshop at the beginning of school. It's more than just, again, a 3-hour responsible conduct of research kind of thing. But graduate students' time is very limited, and they have a lot of demands on that. So I think it is something that should be part of the training. It should be in a course that you need to engage with it for more than a day or a week. It should be sort of a semester-long thing at a minimum. But again, it's a hard thing to do, and it's a hard sell, but I think it is well worth fighting for that and pushing for it.
Great. Micaela, you've described the importance of data ethics and this connection to it. Is this something that you've thought about, how to integrate this into kind of graduate education?
Yeah, I would say that it might almost be easier at the graduate level because, if we're trying to explain all of the ethical and societal perspectives that come into data science project workflows, it's almost easier if they already have kind of some of the foundational data science, the computational, the statistics, the idea of what that data project and that workflow might look like, that you can then layer the ethical dimensions on top of. That's not to say that you can't teach these at the same time. So I think depending on the context, if it's undergraduates that maybe don't have as much of the kind of foundations of data science quite yet, I would see this as an opportunity to teach them together rather than, like Colin was just saying, it's not an ethics seminar on the side. It's not an add-on to a course, but it's actually incorporated into every time you talk about a new topic along the data science workflow, that you incorporate the ethics as well. But from a graduate student perspective, sure, if you were dealing with students that already had some of those foundations, it's just adding even deeper nuance and context for them. And I think importantly, case studies are a huge component. So depending on the level, again, you can kind of look at case studies you can gear the case studies to the level of the student. And I forgot to mention that the Ethos tool does have case studies as part of the tool and part of the pedagogy and learning experience. And we would love to have more folks contribute case studies.
Yeah, it's great. I would also add on that, I think this is something that's also starting earlier. There was a National Academies workshop on K12 data science, and it's been remarkable about what's happening in that realm. We know that there's the AI for K12 framework that's starting to think about what it makes sense to be looking at in terms of learning and machine learning and the like. And we know we need to kind of introduce those earlier. So I think this problem is going to be one that's just going to get bigger. as we start seeing data science happening earlier and earlier.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I completely agree that K through 12, when you're in when you're starting to introduce the concepts of data science, why not do that through those lenses of ethics and societal impact? In fact, that is in some ways a great way to engage students and get them interested in data science. There's a lot of K through 12 students that don't know what data science is and don't feel like it's for them because it's too focused on math and computation and not, wow, I can, understand better the analytics of my favorite sports team or something like that, right? So meeting students where their passions are and is an opportunity to also layer in the ethics and societal concepts.
Great. We have another question that's come in. What's been the hardest part about getting reproducibility into the classroom or into science or into public media? How does it, particularly as we start moving to application areas or other areas, kind of making sure what's been the hardest, what are the barriers, what are the challenges? Aneta, are you willing to take a stab at that?
Yeah, so as a very strong advocate of reproducibility as a also marking criteria in my department, I found it a little bit surprising that when we had quite recently a discussion how to make our marking criteria. I don't know whether you in other countries it's maybe it's different that assessment you have different criteria that you look at the quality of literature review, then about how data is analyzed and so on. So I really advocated to reproducibility, especially in most of the courses are on quantitative methods, to be one of the criteria. But there was interesting, like a little bit of surprise that, oh, but why isn't it only relevant to your course when you ask students to reproduce a paper? And I was like, no, it isn't. This is a broader issue. So I think for me, it was a little bit surprised that even in a space which is about the methods, which is about quantitative methods and a lot of discussion about everybody, most of our teaching is in our students submit our markdown reports for assessment. Then it was a little bit surprising, but then we had a conversation and I could see that within one of the marking criteria, which is about technical aspect of the reports, the reproducibility was included, and now other colleagues sort of already from a year one start commenting on the work of students, about, yeah, you should make it this more clear so your study would be more easily reproduced by other people. Yeah, but I feel like it's, yeah, indeed, it's quite often hard, especially that if you feel like you quite often this lone wolf in your department and you have to start a difficult conversation with people being busy with different, workloads, not very maybe so open to change what they teach. And this is up to you to also explain that I'm not asking you to change your entire assessment, change your syllabus and so on, but this is about the smaller changes, and also that within this larger program we have some similarities. So this method is strengthened from year one to year three, and later this is easier to add, like if you have graduate students, especially if you're saying that the time is limited with graduate students, so it will be easier. So this is like a story from my field.
Great. Rohan, any thoughts on what's been the hardest part?
I found a number. So I found some colleagues dismiss these types of issues as technology specific. So they say, well, these aren't fundamental truths. Abel, can you just wait for 1 minute, please? And so they're concerned that these are, subject to changing trends. They don't know what to teach. And they say, well, let's just leave it for another year or two. They're concerned that it slows down how long it takes them to do work. And one especially interesting and concerning aspect is comparing my wife's experience. She's also an assistant professor here at U of T with my own, is that we found very gendered pushback from students. So I make a mistake when I'm teaching them Git, they say, oh, that's fine. She makes a mistake when she's teaching them Git, and her credibility is dismissed. And so I think that this is another really important aspect of this teaching of reproducibility that we might like to explore at some point as well.
That's a really important observation to kind of be thinking about, because we know that a lot of those factors and disparities exist in lots of different ways. This dovetails really well, Rohan, with some of the other questions we've had of, how do we sell it to colleagues in PhD curriculum to make them believe that it's something otherwise they should just learn on the streets, and also the kind of strategies to help students appreciate the use of these tools. And that's where I think Colin has already given us some examples. Show them the power of it in some fashion, realize that there is going to be that investment early on, but that it can pay off in various ways. I think, I take people through Roman and Wu's spreadsheets. Bad things happen to good people using spreadsheets paper, which I think is one of the largest downloaded papers in the statistics literature, to kind of start to think about these things really matter. We mentioned that in the editorial as well, but I think it's really important to start to think about that. And we know that change happens slowly, and power dynamics can make that more difficult, coming back to Rohan's comment there is, and we really need to be really aware of those differences. It's hard to make change, but we know we need to be making changes in some of these areas. We have just a minute or two left. Anyone else want to comment on that or other questions that have come in?
I think I can just say one thing about getting buy-in from other faculty. It's showing it can work goes a long way. So do it in your class, show that it's working. I think it's one of those things, it's incremental change, because this is one of these things where we used to not have very much programming in our curriculum, and now it starts year one, day one, and it goes all the way through the fourth year. And that's not the work of one person, it's just more and more people buying in. And then once you can show that that works, it becomes more worthwhile with the investment. Graduate, it's harder, it's slower to change. We all want to teach measure theory and do the rest kind of things, because that's what I did when I was a graduate student. But it's something that you can see incremental change. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and you can make small changes. And this is things where it's just collaborating on research projects and showing it works there, and then people will pick that up as their workflow. Then they're more inclined to do it with teaching, co-teach a class, integrate it, and take care of it. And you can see that the investments really pay off. But that's one of those things that people are adverse to change. It's hard to get that initial buy-in, but again, the more you can show them incrementally over time, hopefully the better it goes.
There's been some really sound advice that my colleague Joe Horton from Pomona College gave me a number of years ago, is pick something to change and work on that, and then move through and not try to change everything at once, but to kind of be building those parts and pieces. And it's been neat to me, Colin, to see how the Duke curriculum has done exactly that, kind of worked on something to kind of figure out what the key capacities are and make sure they're integrated in them. And then the students start to sell it throughout in other kinds of ways. So I'm just going to go ahead. We're kind of starting to run out of time. We had some great audience Q&A. I just wanted to kind of close with a little bit of thoughts of, we're working through this special issue. It's been a wonderful 15 months or so to have a chance to work with these fabulous guest editors, other members of the editorial board, the reviewers, the authors of these papers, to create what I think is going to be a really valuable contribution. And I'm excited about it, and I hope people are able to learn as many things from it as I have learned from it. But as we were working through this, it kind of got me thinking, is like, well, where are we with the Journal of Statistics Education? And there's a great paper in Significance magazine from April 2022 that asks about when, not if, when should data and code be made available? Because they argue there quite reasonably that sharing data and code is just part of the computational reproducibility of the work we're doing. And they argue that we don't do this right at the end with supplementary materials. It should be done at the article submission stage. Well, I looked back on the editorial instructions, and while there was a blandishment that all authors are encouraged to share data and code, authors weren't sharing data and code. And so we've gone ahead now, and as of September of this year, all submissions to the journal require a data availability statement, which outlines how code and data that underlie a paper have been made available. Again, this is common for a number of journals, but it's not the case for the majority of journals at this point. I think this is an important area. There are issues in data and code availability, many out there, but we felt that it was critically important for the journal just to kind of help be moving towards a future of more reproducible, transparent science, to kind of go ahead and require a data availability statements. And so that's an area where, again, I think it's going to be important work. We realize this is going to be some additional time for authors putting it forward, but we think it's going to be a trade-off and will lead to kind of better research. Lee, that's what I was hoping we would do, and I think I've kept us within our time limit. The Broman and Wu paper is easy to Google. If you say Broman and Wu spreadsheets, you should be able to get it.
Thank you.
As I said, one of my favorite papers to have students read early on in the course, because they've used Excel. There's a recent survey that of the data science tools used in K12, about 87% of them are using spreadsheets, is how they're dealing with data. They go beyond that in some other ways, but that's something students are very familiar with. So start to see how, again, spreadsheets can lead them astray if they're not used appropriately is, I think, a pretty important. Number of the papers in the issue cite that, and I would add it to people's holiday reading lists as you have time.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for being here and being a part of this panel. Thank you, Nick, Colin, Aneta, Micaela, and Rohan, and your child was adorable. The little quick glance we got of him. Excuse me, sorry. Everyone, I hope you have a wonderful holiday break and that this was kind of a nice food for thought at the end of the semester. And we hopefully will see you back here in January. And for anyone who wanted slides and or the recording, that should be posted shortly afterward on causeweb.org. Bye, everybody.